the questions that Husserl raises are incredibly deep. And I don't know that one seminar is sufficient to expose this depth to you. But I know the readings are very difficult, and I can explain the readings, so that's a small victory.
Are you threatening us with more Husserl seminars?
Yeah, let's talk about that a little.
I think I might come down with the flu.
What you have here is a selection of short passages, which in itself makes it difficult, from 5 different texts. That is Logical Investigations, Ideas, Formal and Transcendental Logic, The Crisis of the European Sciences, and The Origin of Geometry. And that's the order in which they were written, from 1899 to 1936, 37 maybe. And normally, I gave them to you in the order of that they were written, because it seemed logical, and that's how I'll explain it, because they built up on it. But actually, I read them in reverse order. That is, I read The Crisis and the Geometry first, because Harold told me to, and that's what he considered was most important. And they're the most relevant and most accessible to sociologists, because they ask social questions and historical questions. But from there, I worked back to Ideas and Formal and Transcendental Logic, kind of in the middle space. And at the very last, I did the 700-page, 2-volume tome, Logical Investigations, working with one of the world's top Heideggerian scholars, Frederick Olofsson, over 6 months in a graduate seminar. It's fabulous. And that's the most obscure. And so you're starting out reading the most obscure, and you're reading short selections. So don't blame yourself if it was hard. However, Husserl did have a very important influence on Garfinkel. And it's an influence that has been underestimated by most people who never studied with Garfinkel. Originally, they just read Husserl out because they just didn't have an interest themselves, I think. I'm not sure why. They got that he was interested in Wittgenstein, and he was, but he was always more interested in Husserl. And of course, they address similar issues. That denial has been transformed in recent years, judging from what I read and the emails I get, to a kind of theory of a term. You know, Heidegger has this term, the early Heidegger and the late Heidegger. Well, they have developed a kind of account of Garfinkel that he was a phenomenologist and somehow later rejected Husserl and rejected the phenomenology. He never rejected. He had an article on Husserl, one of the last articles he ever wrote in Human Studies. He never took phenomenology on its own terms. He only took anything on his terms. And it's a very unique reading, and it's a very valuable reading. And it's the kind of reading that I'm doing and giving. But the vitality of ethnomethodology, or at least the vitality of Garfinkel's project, started with his reading of Husserl. That's where he got the energy and the interest. And that becomes very clear if you read his doctoral dissertation, which is now available in book form in this book. I think it's Paradigm Press, edited by Ann Rawls, called Seeing Sociologically, 2006. It's a fairly easy read, actually. And it's very clear that Husserl particularly played an important role in his formative stages when he was first grappling with how to study ordinary society. Of course, he was reading after World War II in the late 40s and through the 50s, and there were no English translations then of Husserl. I think the first translations of anything serious was in '62. by an Australian. You know, it's, he was reading Marvin Farber, he was reading Maurice Nathanson, he was reading Aaron Gurvich, who summarized Husserl's arguments in their English language articles. And this is what he lived and breathed in the late 40s and early 50s. And then he started paying students, when he became a professor, to translate from the German, because he didn't read German himself, although he had a good sense for the energy of the language. He would hire students to translate Husserlian texts that were only available in German into English. So for people to say, oh, Husserl wasn't a big influence, it's complete nonsense. But you should be free not to read Husserl if you don't want to. I mean, some of his close students chose not to, and everybody, you know, it's a free life. But you can't say that Husserl didn't play a role. I mean, you don't get to do that. I remember one of my first professors was Peter Berger, who wrote The Social Construction of Reality, and I was telling him I love phenomenology. And he was saying, well, how do you know phenomenology? I said, well, partly your book, and I read a bit of Schutz and a bit of Heidegger and Marvin Farber, because that's the guy who brought phenomenology to America. And he said, yeah, he said, everybody loves Heidegger, everybody loves reading Merleau-Ponty, all the existential stuff people like. But the real meat is Husserl's phenomenology, and nobody has the patience to read that. And so I took that as a challenge, right? I said, okay, and I ended up reading it all. So I felt I satisfied one of my first teachers' efforts to teach me. Now I could have started this series of lectures long ago with Husserl if I was going to do it logically. But I started with the juicy stuff, you know, because I wanted you to enjoy phenomenology. So we read Heidegger, and we read Merleau-Ponty, and we read Mannheim and Schutz. And last, we're doing Husserl. But we're going to take the order of his writings in the toughest first, I guess. I'll tell you, I think Garfinkel is a person who's very difficult to read, but each reading creates something new. And I think Husserl's the same way. I'm still discovering stuff in him. I mean, one of the reasons I like giving seminars on him is that, especially the one I did using the Spanish text in Buenos Aires, you know, in Spanish I discovered, I never noticed that before, and I go back to the English, and sure, it's there all along, but I think you know well, after having read through this stuff, it's possible for your eyes to slide across the page and not capture things. But when you're reading in a foreign language, you're forced to go more slowly. So it's actually a good way to get a fresh look on something you've already read. So I'm obviously excited about Husserl, one of the few, right, which ought to drum me out of any parties, right? Okay, so let's start. I hope we can finish. You ought to be able to ask lots of questions, because I think questions are good when you don't understand. But I don't think we're going to be able to do questions and get through this. So we'll have to choose at some point to get through or to ask the question. Let's start with Logic Investigations. The Chapter 3 title is, you see the page is 312, right? So if Chapter 3 is at 312, you know you've been in for it for a while. Actually, it's the introduction, which you ought to read, which takes up most of those pages. The chapter title is called Fluctuation in Meaning and the Ideality of Unities of Meaning. So we're looking at fluctuation and unities of meaning, which ought to be, on the face of it, a fascinating topic, right? And he talks about, if you read the first sentence, in our last chapter, we dealt with the act of meaning. Just to see meaning as an act is something that is turning philosophy into a social science, because an act is something people do. And that's what phenomenology looks at, is acts. Later in the paragraph, he talks about the shifting acts of meanings. It's this flux of relations. How do these meanings shift? He can't talk about this without looking at social phenomena, without looking at communication. Because that's why the meaning is shifting. It isn't shifting all by itself. I mean, I suppose you could have a study of somebody whose understanding changes as they read through, but he is looking at social things. And understand, he spent much of his life thinking about these issues in conjunction with a fellow German Jewish scholar, and Georg Simmel. And they corresponded, and he read his books, Simmel's books, and I think you see the dialogue. A lot of this stuff, I think, originates with some of Simmel's madness. At least there's the influence there. So this, on the bottom of that paragraph where he says, 5 lines up, expressions whose meaning shifts. It's just, this is a fascinating topic. I wanted to teach my students this, and I'm not going to teach students by reading Husserl, at least not sociology students who are graduates and in some cases undergraduates. Actually, in this case, it was undergraduates, because I decided I was going to teach them about expressions whose meaning shifts by having them go out and study coffee tasting. And they went out and filmed people tasting coffee and looked at how those descriptors changed their meaning over the course of the cupping. Some of them were professionals, and some of them were lay consumers. And it was such a great topic, it became a major research topic for me. It's great fun. I mean, there's nothing more fun in the world than studying the shifting of sense. I mean, it really it makes you less absolute in your personality and character. I mean, it makes you dance to the ironies of life. And so he's got a good handhold. And the question then is, how do these shifting meanings become unities of meaning? How do we tame this amorphous beast so that we can get on with things? And that's what he's studying. And that involves social work. When people create what he calls objectivated forms, he says in the next section, 25, that there can be 2 kinds. There can be kinds that have some intimations. Those in the 3rd line of section 25 on 312. Those that also intimate what they name. Intimate, he defines in the last sentence of this section. If we limit on 313, if we limit intimation in the narrower sense to experiences which carry an expression's meaning. So there are some expressions that you know just what they mean. It's sort of clear. But then there are also those, he says, quote, in whose case named and intimated contents fall asunder. That nobody knows what they mean. They might not even know themselves what they mean. And it's like an empty palette or an empty shell, that the name is there, there's an objectivation, there's an expression, people are focusing on the expression, but it's like an empty palette. It still remains to determine its content. And so it's inherently a social phenomenon because it presents local parties, we would call them members, with the task of turning those objectivated forms into something that people can understand together and can work with. And so that's a practical task that people face, and that's what Garfinkel was up to all his life. There's no early or later. If you look on section 26, he speaks of essentially occasional and objective expressions. And he speaks in the middle of 314, right after the question mark, just above the middle on 314, can we there still stick to self-identical meaning unities? So meaning unities has to do with how do we make these meanings unified? How do we produce unified meanings so that it's clear what they mean and so that everybody's clear about what they mean? That's what he means by objective. And of course, because he's doing phenomenology, the how of that is much more interesting to him than the what. The self-identical means it keeps the meaning as the event develops, and even the next day. You have a meaning unity that remains the same, but it doesn't remain the same all by itself. It remains the same because of the work that the parties are doing to sustain that unity of sense. So we're interested in just how those members produce that unity of sense as a major task. It might be the social activity sine qua non. He speaks on 314, just below the middle. He's got two italicized phrases. The first is, and I've written it up here, essentially subjective and occasional expressions. And he defines that at the top of 315. He says, on the other hand, we call an expression essentially subjective and occasional, or more briefly, essentially occasional, if it belongs to a conceptually unified group of possible meanings, in whose case it is essential to orient actual meaning to the occasion, the speaker, and the situation. That's basically indexicality, right? It's meanings the way they happen in the real world. They have an indexical character to them. But then he talks about objective expressions, the second term in italics, and he defines that on 314 in that next paragraph. We shall call an expression objective if it pins down, or can pin down, its meaning merely by its manifest auditory pattern, and can be understood without necessarily directing one's attention to the person uttering it, or to the circumstances of the utterance. This is basically a definition of objective. But you feel Husserl's struggling in providing us with a definition of objective, because it's a very tough thing. And that's what's kept me doing my coffee research. Everybody uses the term objective, and everybody has a different idea. The way the term is used in society and in science varies dramatically. What is objective? That's a radical question. It's an ethnomethodological question, because it's what people are doing. And I mean, does what Husserl provides us here, if if it pins down its meaning merely by its manifest auditory pattern and can be understood without necessarily directing one's attention to the person uttering it, does that exhaust the meaning of objectivity? What more can there be? Objectivities don't happen on their own. They involve practical work. And in an ethnomethodological way, I don't want to solve the problem, answer the question, what more can objective mean, by theorizing. I want to go out and watch people do it. And so Garfinkel did that, and toward the end of his teaching, he came up with this model of interaction in which the local work of accounting was, in fact, the practical work of people trying to continuously upgrade these subjective and occasional expressions with objective expressions. And you'll read in his writings how they're always trying to get this substitution. That is, to substitute the objective expression for the occasional expression because it helps them organize the orderliness of their local affairs. Now, Garfinkel also was very suspicious of that, and it's suspicion he I would say, cultivated during his reading of Husserl's Crisis, because that's the crisis of the European sciences. In their concern with objectivity, they forgot to see. That is, they forgot that there were these earlier moments of originality in which things were still in play, and that they, in fact, substituted those occasional expressions for objective expressions. So they lost the phenomenon. And so we are ever critical of objectivist, positivist strategies for losing the phenomenon. But I think we can go too far with that criticism, because you need some degree of objectivation just to function. And I'm observing, witnessing, by going to the real world and looking at coffee tasters doing objective work, I'm realizing that the objectivities that they produce actually help them inquire into the flavors of coffee, that they'd be lost without those objectivities. But that doesn't mean that they can just settle for the objectivities and turn their minds off. They have to constantly realize that those objectivities are social productions. Because those objectivities, those reductions, those formulations, those accounts will never exhaust the potential sense there is in worldly investigations, whether you're a geologist or a coffee taster. So if you're going to be original and discover, as I've said many times, what you need to know most, which is what it is you don't know, then you're going to need to be open, and that openness comes from doing the phenomenological bracketing. That is, understanding that these are production practices, that we are producing these objectivities, and to understand the nature of their reality. And we'll talk about that in a second when we move to ideas. So this practical work consists of substituting the objective expressions for occasional expressions, and it's work that's never finished, the world being what it is. And so a lot of maintenance is required, and so ethnomethodologists study this maintenance. This maintenance implies that, as he says at the end of that large paragraph at the top, first half of page 314, that ends with the sentence, obviously we are here dealing with a case of unavoidable rather than chance ambiguity. No kidding. One that cannot be removed from our language, one that cannot be removed from our life, he means to say, by an artificial device or convention. That is, the indeterminacy is the nature, and of course Merleau-Ponty picked up on this big time, right? He wrote a lot about indeterminacy, which we, as members of the Enlightenment, Euro-American civilized people want to limit the indeterminacies because we want to be certain about everything. And we need certainty in order to believe our own propaganda, and it's a lot easier to proceed in our affairs when we believe our own propaganda. But these indeterminacies are very difficult, obviously, Husserl informs us. So I would say, as an aside, there are two kinds of people. Some people who get disturbed at these indeterminacies when the organized meaning falls apart, and those who get delighted by it when it falls apart. We're the second kind. You know, if you're disturbed when the meaning falls apart, and there's some researchers in our EMCA field who do get disturbed by that, although most don't. But there's some that do. Then probably you should find some other meaningful academic or non-academic employment, right? You might become an accountant or something. Of course, they probably know better the indeterminacies.
Well, look at your tax bill. Indeterminacies?
What's that?
Look at your tax bill. Indeterminacies? I mean, there are a lot of indeterminacies even in accountants.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. The taxes. Yeah. The actually, there's probably a third kind. Okay, so there's people who get disturbed by indeterminacies. People who celebrate and dance every one they discover, and I urge you to be that kind. But there's also a third kind, which is people, either capitalists or politicians, who seek to profit by each situation that comes apart. I imagine people like Napoleon were brilliant at that. Right? But anyway, we don't have time for jokes. So he says at the bottom, 6 lines from the bottom of 314, that objectivity depends on the tenor of the talk already in progress and the tendencies it arouses. The tendencies talk arouses? My goodness, it seems Husserl's studying talk. Way back in 1899? I mean, that's really remarkable. Anyway, in these situations, we're very interested in learning just how expressions become objective. And across the page, in the last phrase of that first paragraph on 315, he speaks about these expressions sometimes as having generally graspable, sufficiently reliable clues to guide the hearer to the meaning intended in the case in question. Okay? I mean, understand that he and Simmel didn't have tape recorders. That's the best that they could write. If they're going to study talk, sufficiently reliable clues to guide the hearer, right? But if he had transcripts and he had the tools that we had, I mean, I think he would have probably even done more work in this. Anyway, we're doing the work, so we ought to be happy. But it's not like Husserl's way over there, disconnected, in my view. Okay, in the next section, that's section 38, he's speaking about objectifying acts and noema. And don't be confused by noema. Noesis is the live thinking of your mind. Noema are the products of that thinking, the transitory, shifting objectivation of those thinking. That is, in this diagram that I put up, if we're thinking, and I mean, a positivist would say, okay, we just see the facts, and we're just representing what we see. But a phenomenologist realizes that, in fact, we are projecting the sense on the object. We're seeing something in the light of our interests. So we're formulating it. And this it's not strictly conceptual, but this is the noema. the framework through which our thinking passes that helps us, like coffee descriptors, to coordinate our deeper and ever-deepening understanding of the object that we're investigating. So noema is this. It's like an account, it's like a term, or it can be something less than that. He says that the function of objectivated noema is to hold and preserve, or to present. That's a term he gets from Brentano, who was his teacher, right? Oh, did I knock it? To present formulated thoughts. And on page 130, on page 639, right? We're moving along quickly in this. He speaks of the widest concept that the term presentation can stand for, and he names this objectivating acts. And this term presentation is given a recent reflection by Günter Fegal, who is professor of philosophy at Freiburg, in his recent book Objectivity, and you might want to have a look at his chapter on presentation. He speaks about single rate acts in this section and many rate acts. And single rate acts are things when I just see one item like a chair, but let's say, you know, I've got a dozen different things I have to pack into my car. Some square, some round, some long, some with legs that don't unscrew off. And it's a many rate act that I'm engaging in. And in terms of ideas, we have lots of dimensions of ideas. The taste of coffee has many dimensions, and I'm moving in many directions at once, but I'll capture it all under a general term, like oily seeds or something, or roundness. And there's a tendency then, just for the purpose of being able to function, for us to turn those many rate acts into unities, into first unities retaining the many rays, but ideally with a single ray, because the many rayed unities are very unstable and are difficult to work with interactionally. And so these are turned into what he calls monothetic acts. In fact, many rayed acts are synthesized and objectivated to help a local cooperative group function successfully. If you look on the bottom of 639. It is true, that's 4 lines from the bottom on page 369 of we're in investigation 5 of logical investigations. It is true of the conjunctive, or better, collective synthesis, as it is true of the predicative synthesis, that it permits of nominalization, in which case the collective object constituted by the synthesis becomes the simply presented object of a new single rate act, and so is made objective in the present sense of the word. So you get all this work, it's social work, to condense the indexical meanings in a single term that maybe the coffee tasters are using. It might still be somewhat indeterminate, but it carries enough of these many rayed senses that the single term can be used in writing it down on a form so that it can be passed on to the roaster, so the roaster knows what flavor he's aiming at, or to the buyer so he knows what kind of beans to buy. But the question is, and we're going to see this when we get to the passages in the Crisis that Husserl offers us, the objective form gets passed to the roaster, but does the meanings do the meanings get past? This is the problem of every religion, right? You have these great guys with long beards having these wonderful insights, and they develop these liturgies and write these books, Bibles even, commentaries, that get transmitted. I mean, we just had Passover last week. I mean, you have a whole written procedure. You say this, you eat this, you say that, you eat that. You're supposed to remember slavery, and it's just a social occasion. It's so shallow. It's embarrassing. Most Passovers, most Seder dinners I go to, I'm embarrassed for my own people because it's so superficial, because it's such a profound, radical, revolutionary political experience in its origin. So how do you get back to that original sense? How do you revivify, was Durkheim's term, the form that gets passed down? So we're committed to this. We don't live forever, so we have to institutionalize our ideas, and we have to simplify the ideas or they won't successfully get passed down. So we turn these many rays into single rays. We turn these several accounts into a single summary account, and you go on to any tape that you make, and you'll hear the accounts, and you'll hear a gradually economizing account so that one term will stand for everything that people have thought through and experienced while they're tasting the coffee or whatever they're doing. And how does that term retain that sense? That's the question that Husserl asks in reference to geometry in The Crisis and in The Origin of Geometry. And we'll come to that after the break. So, okay, so, I mean, it's difficult stuff, but it's real stuff. It's real stuff because we're studying accounts. We're studying how people do that coordination of meaning. But of course, do itself is a problematic word. Do is a relic of the Enlightenment. It's a relic of the great age of the rationalist, the Cartesian subject who's in charge of everything. We're clueless most of the time. There's no such animal as that. So we're not doing things as things are being done to us. We're in the midst of these activities, the flux of what Simmel called reciprocal stimulations of meanings, are just moving, and we're finding a way to work with them as they're passing us by. We're not like master builders the way it's easy to write, provided you don't have to leave your study, right? If you go out and study and find people in the real world, you realize, oh my God, here is a collection of 35 of the world's best whatever, nuclear scientists, astronomers, and they're not sure what they're doing either, right? I mean, it's amazing. So we talk about doing and we talk about production practices, but there needs to be as much passivity as activity. And Husserl came to realize this too, but those books have only just been translated in a new volume, or now not so new, about 10 years ago. Anthony Steinbach translated Husserl's text on passive synthesis, which I think, I mean, Husserl lived 100 years ago without video recorders, so it's pretty amazing what he came up with. Okay, let's move on to ideas. Ideas is probably a decent place to start. It's a good book to carry with you. If you get a paperback, it's like one of these books that you don't need to bring many other books. So it's light to travel with. It's good for backpacking. If you look on 113, this is in section 50 of ideas. The fourth line on page 113, there's a reference to the German text 94 at the top right of that page. It should be the next page right after Theological Investigations.
Yes.
You have it there?
Yes. Oh. This 112, 113.
Okay. Well, I'll go and read it.
Yes.
Reality is not in itself something absolute, which becomes tied secondarily to something else. Rather, in the absolute sense, it is nothing at all. It has no absolute essence, whatever. It has the essentiality of something which, of necessity, is only intentional. Right? Intentional is Brentano's term, Brentano being Husserl's teacher. Only an object of consciousness. Something presented in the manner peculiar to consciousness. Something apparent as apparent. So, this is a very radical statement. Reality, basically, is not what we think it is. If we think that reality is this object, after we've erased all of that, standing in itself, then that doesn't exist. There are trees, but there are trees that are part of a process in which I am intending, this line is the line of intentionality, that I participate. In other words, say that there are no facts, there are only interpretations. Or they're only, all facts are interpreted. That might be another way to say it. Why does reality lack self-sufficiency in terms of its essence? Because its being depends on our understanding. Its essentiality is only intentional, which means it is only an object of consciousness, like society. Who would argue society exists? It's not there. It's an ideal notion, right? Or your identity, right? Who am I? You know, I'm a candlestick maker, right? I'm an Indian chief, right? All these are constructions that don't really exist, right? That doesn't mean they have no function. They have a kind of existence. Now, he refers in 113 to living naively in experience. Living naively in experience is like really believing in the independent reality. Like, I really am a movie star, you know. I'm hot, can't you tell? Right? And so you have Judy Garland committing suicide, right? Because it turns out she was not so hot as wasn't her fault. The world led her to believe she was that hot. She was too young to work it out, right? It happens to a lot of childhood actors. So if you realize this lack of independence, that this reality is not the truth of our being, there'd be some measure of safety maybe. But you still need to use these things. I mean, there's a sense in which this coffee does have a round flavor or have woody flavor. But the woodiness is your invention. It's not the coffee itself. And so you need to proceed. You need to learn how to proceed with those objectivated notions that help you understand the coffee better, but you can't be limited by your use of those objectivated notions. So how do you use those notions? How do you use those objectivities in a wise way would be a way I would say it. And so he develops the phenomenological reduction, this practice of putting out of action our positings. And if you look on 114, in the middle of the page, after the IE, just above the 95, reference to the German edition, page 114 of the English, we parenthesize the positings affected. For our new inquiries, we do not participate in these positings. Instead of living in them, instead of affecting them, we affect acts of reflection directed to them. So instead of living in them, instead of taking them seriously, instead of believing your propaganda, you look at how they got to be what they were. And that will open you up to the whole historicality of how they got to be made, and it will open you up. Hopefully you can go back far enough to find how they got to be made and get the horizon of original experience that you had at that moment. It's like if you're following a map and you get lost and the map, the unity of sense of the map falls asunder because it doesn't, the place you found doesn't correspond with how you interpreted the dots on the map. You go back to the point where you were really sure, where you really had the map in hand, and then you start out again because you can't just capture the meaning of the map at that point. You need to capture the horizon of meaning, this futural anticipation of what's coming next. You have to go back and capture it at a point where you knew where it was. So it's kind of like archaeology, I suppose. Archaeology of consciousness. I think Foucault already did that, but anyway. So, by positing, he's merely talking about this era. But what we're talking about here is there's an era in which it's really the arrow's going in both directions. You have the landscape is transformed by the way we posit it, and that landscape feeds back to us and gives us a new perspective from which to posit further. So there's a circular, I suppose, process of understanding. In any case, what's interesting for us is not just how this happens with one person, but how people together do this. But in both cases, we keep our minds trained on what he's calling here a sense-bestowing consciousness. And so the first definition of phenomenology would be the study of sense-bestowing consciousness. Or he says in the last line of this section 50, in the middle of the page on page 114, the infinite field of absolute mental processes, the fundamental field of phenomenology. Now that fundamental field of phenomenology is italics. It makes you even more determined to figure out what on earth is he talking about by infinite and absolute, right? I mean, it's not apparent. Absolute here simply means strictly. It's like just looking at the thinking part by itself. Sometimes he uses the word pure. Just looking at what is the mind doing regardless of what's really out there. I mean, like, even if you're hallucinating, is there an hallucination? Let's capture, if it's really happening in your mind, then it's real enough for us to capture, right? So that's the absolute mental processes. And infinite because there's so much, we don't have enough paper to write the field notes for all of that the people are doing, so we have to be selective. And of course, Garfinkel's advice is select those aspects that are most identifying of the work they're doing. Anyway, the second definition of phenomenology is it's the study of the immanent structures of consciousness, right? That is the stuff that's going on. Immanent means really close up. There's two words in English. I don't know how it comes out in Danish, but immanent and immanent. Immanent is spatial and immanent is temporal. Okay? And we're talking about the spatial. Heidegger's phrase was proximally and for the most part. You know, that means proximally means really in your face. Okay. Let's move on to 55. And he says in the second line in italics, all real unities are unities of sense. That is, society isn't real, my identity isn't real. Well, it is real, but that real unity is a unity of sense. That is, it's related to the sense-bestowing consciousness. He says, you see on line 2 and 3 of 129, the phrase sense-bestowing consciousness. And then a few lines down in the italics again, he says that's line 8, maybe 9. An absolute reality is just as valid as a round square. Reality and world are names here precisely for certain valid unities of sense. And he doesn't here mean any subjectivism. These things are really happening. You really do think these things. So there's no subjectivism involved. There's no real idealism involved. In Garfinkel's book, Seeing Sociologically, that was based on his dissertation, he talks about the sterilities of subjectivism. He was very clear at the outset he's not into subjectivism, which is why he got a little upset when everybody first reviewed ethnomethodology as being subjectivist, because he was opposed to that from the get-go. That is, the phenomenological reduction excludes the naive natural attitude that believes its own propaganda. So it's just rejecting the bullshit. I mean, it's not like qualifies one for being objective. Just because you don't believe all the positivist propaganda doesn't make you a subjectivist, right? That is, if facts are really interpreted facts, then thinking that they're facts all by themselves is to be biased. And even though it sounds like bias belongs with that word interpretation. But if the interpretation is really going on, then that's not subjective. I mean, it's not idealism. Excluding the natural attitude means that we do not dream the objectivations are severed from consciousness, or from the immanent, if we're going to talk more like ethnomethodologists, those objectivations, those accounts, those formulations, those organizing ideas are never separated from the immanent interactional processes that generate those local structures. Okay, so let's go on to 87. The
87?
Yeah, it's a couple of pages later.
Oh, sorry.
It's page 211, but since it says chapter 3. Now, why this is this is ideas chapter 3. He talks here about, he's critical of, one may have, it's towards 8 lines from the bottom, one may of course use the word phenomenology, but one does not have the matter itself. He's already upset midway in his career that people are saying phenomenology this and phenomenology that and don't have a clue what it is. Just as Harold was really upset about people talking about ethnomethodology this and ethnomethodology that, and he wanted to stop using the word. He didn't want to talk about ethnomethodology, he wanted to engage in actual studies instead of talking about engaging in actual studies. So the rigor is necessary if you don't have phenomenology, unless you get to a kind of very austere analysis in which you're tough-nosed about not accepting anything theoretical. He's not trying to be theoretical. It's more like the observations of bird watchers. You know, he's just not watching birds building nests. He's watching human beings thinking. He says on the next page, 212, I'm not sure where, but he talks about it, people unencumbered, I mean, he talks about himself, unencumbered by all current and learned theories, sort of satirizing learned theories. We don't want a theory. He says about, I don't know, a third the way up from the bottom, rather than living in the perception adverted to the perceived and considering and theorizing, they do not manage to direct the regard instead to the perceiving. That is, he wants to not be distracted. He finds theorizing a distraction. So there's even I would say, a fraternity here with the ideological aspects of those phenomenologists who tell me, at any rate, that they don't read Husserl because they think theory is a distraction and Husserl is a theorist, so they don't read Husserl. And if they were to read Husserl, they would get the advice from him that they shouldn't be theorizing things. Okay. And I think it's sound advice. And that doesn't mean that we can't over-theorize with phenomenology. We just have to be really disciplined and not do it. That's where the rigor is. In the next section, 102, it also covers objectivation. It discusses the nomadic object, that is the object that functions as a sign, a designation, a unity in the mental process. You see objectivation in italics on 249, and Garfinkel picks up that term and uses it from 1950 onwards. It's this objectivation that is a nomadic core in Husserl's language. It's used by people to coordinate their thinking, to hold, remember I said, to preserve and present the object that they found using that way of looking at it, to preserve it so that they continue to experience it in that way. That nomadic core allows that, not only allows us to have that experience, but it allows us to share that experience, provided that we give a name to it and indicate something about what's to be done with that name. So it's what allows a group to proceed as a collective body. Okay. There's a very interesting passage in section 121, which is a couple of pages later. That reveals that Husserl had an active scope of social phenomena in sight. And I'll read the passage to you on page 289 under section 121, and then we'll talk about it. That's line 5 on 289. For example, the mother who looks lovingly upon her flock of children embraces each child singly and altogether in one act of love. The unity of the collective act of loving is not a loving and in addition a collective objectivating, even if it is attached to the loving as its necessary foundation. Loving instead is itself collective. Now, that's a very curious passage because it's an incredibly social kind of analysis. It's one of those relatively few occasions in which Husserl specifically is examining a collective activity rather than an activity of individual consciousness. And it shows that it's not that he's completely ignorant of the social. Although, given the prejudice of his time, he always goes back to the classical, philosophical, Cartesian individual consciousness, which I think is a flaw. But he's fully aware, and I think to some extent that motivated his interest in Simmel, and Simmel taught him even more about this interest. That this idea of collective objectivating, which I think I put up here, is I think the story. It's not. He finds this interesting. It's not something added on. It's like something foundational. So that's interesting, but it's not foundational enough so that when Husserl or when Husserlian philosophers start doing their formal phenomenological analyses, that they provide such an originary reading of the collective objectivation when they analyze. I mean, they basically reduce everything to the individual. I've had these arguments for years in the phenomenology meetings. That is, its collective character is primordial. People don't know what they're doing ahead of time and then negotiate meanings like the social contract. That's mythology. Garfinkel would say that's a just so story. It doesn't happen that way. And Heidegger already understands it, and that's why Garfinkel read Heidegger. That's what got him excited, because this phrase you get in Heidegger, it's always already known. That always already implies that people don't start with a tabula rasa and then add it up due to some kind of phenomenological process of synthesizing meanings and get to a deductive conclusion. Rather, Heidegger's talking about the always already. We're thrown into the world not of our own making with the solution in our hands, and only at that point do we start to make sense of what it is I've got. And at that point, that's when Garfinkel wants to be there. How does that sense-making happen? What are those achieved coherences, right? I mean, it's incredibly radical, and, I remember Zahavi saying, no, arguing with him about the originality of collective thinking. No, all that's in Husserl. Oh, you got to read more carefully. You got to read more carefully. And he's right. But there's even more, I think. It's even more important than I think he appreciates. Anyway. Then he talks, in this page, he goes on to talk about an emotional objectivity. Okay, once you start talking about an emotional objectivity, I can tell you, all the scientists at my university are going to check out, right? They punch their exit card on emotional objectivity, right? But there are these, let's say there's a Bruce Springsteen song, or just every Bruce Springsteen concert, for Pete's sake, is an emotional objectivation, right? I mean, wow, and it's a different experience because of its collective character. And if you don't know anything about Bruce Springsteen and you come into it that way, it's only a collective phenomenon and not an individual one. I mean, and you can hear really well that way. And so if it's really going on, it's not subjectivist, it is objective. But then the question is, and now we want to ask this question in the most radical way possible, how is it objective? That is, how can this example shed light upon what it is to be objective? How does this emotion that gets subjectivated as an object noema for everyone to share and to use for harmonizing their actions? He speaks of the unity of a collective liking. I mean, there's a lot going on. I don't know anyone who's really commented much on this passage. It's sort of buried deep in ideas, and not. I don't think he comes back to it. My problem is, I don't read German, and there's more stuff that's in Husserl's library in Belgium than there is that's been translated, right? I mean, so I can't really be a bona fide Husserlian scholar if I don't read German, right? So everybody said, why haven't you read German? I had my hands full, you know? I mean, anyway. And I don't have enough years to do that. But who knows? Okay, move on to my favorite book, Formal and Transcendental Logic, and then we'll take a break after we do this.
Isn't that... Oh yeah, that's number 2.
That is, well, 16 and 17, well,
yeah.
116 and 117?
That's his number 2 readings.
Okay.
We sent it in 2 packages.
Oh, did we?
So.
Okay. Subsection F, the categorical formations. Every time I type categorical, Microsoft Word wants to do a spell check. They'll change it for me. No. I mean, I like to turn everything they do off. Habitual and intersubjective possessions. Okay. Okay, here again, in this passage, and I selected for that reason from Formal Transcendental Logic, I should add, I think is Husserl's best book because more than any other book, he wrote it from beginning to end as one coherent piece. All logical investigations, ideas are kind of like just like Wittgensteinian notebooks, right? With topics that have organization for a large range of pages, but the whole book isn't one particular piece. In fact, a lot of his work now are his unpublished works, and then you never know how much the editor's doing. You know, whether the editor's Landgrabe or many others. But here, this was his piece, and I think it's a good one to read if you want to get into the real Husserl. Anyway, here in this passage, he talks about a community of judges again, and judges in the plural, and of categorical objectivities as constituted in the judgment community. So that's certainly a social phenomenon. We can talk about a lot of things, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to stick with the most relevant. And I find those in G, the objectivity given beforehand. He identifies two kinds of objectivity here. He identifies the objectivity given beforehand, and he contrasts that with the categorical objectivity produced by thinking. So the the objectivity beforehand is like received ideas, like I don't know, I suppose a prayer book for a particular ceremony, or a prayer, or something that's handed down that everybody knows something about, and it's given beforehand. But then there are those things that you yourself produce. He says the one given beforehand is the pooled experience of a community. That is in line 6. And there's some very interesting things about this discussion, but the social aspect should be clear. The sense of what's handed down is really only evident when it's embodied in actual affairs, and he calls that meaning fulfillment or sense fulfillment. That you get this this thing that's handed down, and then this objectivity handed down, and then you have to, well, Durkheim's term was vivify, but they were writing at the same time. I suppose they read each other. But he's talking about you have to make it come alive again in this sense fulfillment. But I mean, even though there's this division between these long-standing, maybe, you know, they can be 1,000 years, 2,000 years objectivities that get passed down from generation to generation, from one congregation to the next. But they're still categorically formed. I mean, categorical objectivity is categorical, obviously, because you're making it and you're synthesizing a sense for it. But my mind's going 12 places. They're both involved categorical formations. There's no way that you can, there's no objectivity that stands on its own. You always have to develop its horizon of sense and application. But there is a distinction in terms of the pedigree of an objectivity and something that's brand new. There are, like in the coffee business, there are forms that people use. And there are respected forms that have been used for decades in thousands of international top prize coffee tasting. And you respect that form. Or there are forms that you develop just because you're not happy with that form for the coffees that you have to maybe you're in Italy and the form's based on infusion and you're doing espressos and you need a different form. The form that I saw at BKI Coffee in Aarhus 2 days ago, it's a really fascinating form because it's briefer than most forms and it's less quantitative, though there are some quantitative indications on it. But they would be lost without that form. They would be really, it allows them to make sure they remember to look at all these aspects of the flavor, and it's oriented toward their practical needs of finding defects and of making sure that the coffees they're buying are good enough for the blends that they're intent on making. But then they can fill in the form, and they then pass on the form to other people, and then they have to understand what that form means. So the question again is, what is objectivity? If you give it a number, the Italians are very precise. It's an 80.5, just above the level you need to be certified, right? So it's objective, right? But, you know, bless their souls, they know that it's not that objective. It's very objective, but what is objective? And there's some odd things going on in that, you know, the coffee was roasted a week ago, 2 weeks ago, so it's not going to have the flavor. If I'm going to judge it fairly, maybe if it only gets a 79.5, it should qualify. You know, you have to use some wisdom and judgment. Anyway, what I'm saying is that the categorical operations, the need to resituate each form. I mean, I'm trying to get at what is objectivity. Husserl's question is, how do we make our experiencing itself and its productions a theme of judgment? You're not taking it for granted. You're not accepting the propaganda, oh, it's 80.5, it's on the best form by the best teachers, it's fact. You're looking at the process of judgment. You're looking at the synthetic activities, the categorical activities of a judgment community. Now, Husserl uses a very important research strategy, and he talks about this on 119. He says, on the very top of 119, if we go on synthetically, to make our experiencing itself and its productions a theme of judgment, only then can we have original knowledge of the fact that this harmoniously flowing experiencing already bears implicitly in itself, before our thinking and the categorical formations produced by our thinking, the being sense of nature, as the same sense that thinking explicates. And he says all this, too, is anything but a piece of argumentative idealism. He doesn't want just theory. It is obtained not from any speculating epistemology, right? He gets accused of being an epistemologist, or standpoint philosophy. That's static philosophy. That's the philosophy of positivists. But from plain sense investigation and discovery. I mean, can you see how this statement here is sympathetic with the motivating statement of ethnomethodology? Not standpoint philosophy, but plain sense investigation and discovery. So he wants to go to the things themselves. And then there's remarkable continuity between ideas and formal and transcendental logic. So our studies are studies of sense investigation, but our studies also many times have been too conceptual. And we need to learn how to pay more attention to the aconceptual phenomena by which the world gains its coherency. I know that's a theoretical observation, but how do I not reduce everything, all coherencies, to the conceptual? I mean, we need to find research domains which are tough to turn into concepts. And it's hard to study that because these aconceptual coherencies are invisible. I mean, it's hard to know. I'm studying these surfers, and I can't know for sure 3 times out of 4, and I'm a surfer, and they're all taken for granted, right? I mean, Garfinkel says that in many places, and so they kind of like slip in under one's gaze as a sort of course phenomenon. So to turn those into perspicuous cases is the task, and that's why Garfinkel went to the inverting lenses and the pedestrian crossings and the freeway traffic, things like that. So here's another definition for ethnomethodology. We're studying the taken for granted coherencies that provide the foundation of ordinary sense. The taken for granted, these gestalt coherencies, to use Gurvich's phrase. Okay, should we? Yeah, let's just finish the formula transcendental logic, and then we'll come back and do the crisis. On the next section, on 125, I think that's Greek C, although it looks like a Y. The scientist's attitude. We have more discussion of categorical objectivities, and they don't exist before our thinking. And yet, as soon as we think them, they seem to be existing by themselves, just as soon as we come up with them. I mean, just as soon as Geertsen-Hoop would say, just as soon as they clean up the data and they find the star's all there by itself, right? It's no longer dependent on the data. I mean, just happens instantly. So, in what sense, if Husserl is right, if Husserl is correct about them being always categorically formed, always synthesized, then in what sense can they be objective? Can they be objective? What do we mean by objective if they are partly our production? Well, to some sense, there's a tangibility to that objective. A tangibility as an object, as in taste descriptors, have a tangibility to them. The noema, what allows them to retain the idea is that they have this objectivity to them. They have this tangibility to them. The intention aimed at cognition passes clear through these noema, he tells us on 125. You can't think without them. And they're even more important in social affairs. They're not just important for our own thinking, the way classical phenomenology would think it, but they're important in social affairs. And in fact, but there's an added problem. Once a categorical objectivity is given a name, and that nominal form is appreciated and confirmed by everybody, it all of a sudden gains a moral value. And that moral value tweaks everything. It's hard to see clearly after the expectation that this is the truth starts being laid upon us. But that's a separate topic. He actually does talk a little about that, but we're not going to. But he says on this page, these cognitional acquisitions are abiding and accessible to everyone. Okay, that's the important thing. And he says every scientific statement has this sense from the start. It's already addressed to this everyone. So this is social and expresses Husserl's interest in communication as well. I think Husserl's implying that the process of constructing these ideal objectivities is the same for the scientist as it is for the everyday judger, as he calls it. But that leads us to the question, so what then is the difference between scientific objectivity and objectivity for the everyday judgers? he answers that by saying that the difference is that the scientist is more inclined, more habituated, in his terms, to re-examining his or her objectivities than are ordinary persons, who are less likely to question themselves and less likely to re-examine things. If you look at the bottom of 124, 4 lines from the bottom, not that the scientist does not judge at all before such a having of the affairs themselves, the objectivities themselves that belong to the particular categorical level. But he takes all prior judgments as only provisional. The categorical objectivities accepted in them as only provisionally accepted, as merely supposed objectivities. So there's a willingness to surrender what's become habitual among scientists, a greater willingness to surrender your affiliation compared with people in everyday life. Now, Schutz added another one in his writings in terms of the difference between common sense thinkers and scientific thinkers. He says that the scientists systematically expose their thinking to criticism of other people. That's not that they're thinking any differently. I mean, he agrees with Husserl to that extent, that they're using the same processes, but they're more open to this kind of negative criticism, and that's part of the process. You know, what they say isn't true, but you have peer review and you have a consensus and debate and dialectics, and at the end of that, you have something you don't have in everyday life. But the structuring of the prejudgments is similar. You might try to employ this taking as only provisional, this endless suspicion of yourself as a constant practice. And if you do, it's for sure you won't be invited to the parties that they have at the university. You know those sociologists. I mean, we're constantly questioning authority, right? We have a bumper sticker in Eugene, question authority, right? Everybody likes to put that on their car, question authority. Well, but the people who put that on their car are questioning other people's authority. Husserl's talking about questioning your own authority, right? That's really more helpful. And that's the good coffee. That's why I love the coffee thing. They do that a lot because they have to do that. Because their cards, their descriptors are hemming them in at every stage, while every cup of coffee they taste is breaking them out, causing them to move through them and transcend them. So the crisis in science that Husserl speaks of is when scientists fail to live up to this constant self-criticism, or what Husserl calls in this text radical self-understanding. Radical self-understanding, it's a great notion, and I think even a great term. Radical self-understanding is understanding that is bifocal. It's looking at the object and trying to nail down, what that geological formation is. But as it's doing, as Hoppe demonstrated to us, the astronomers have to do as part of their trade, you have to look at yourself looking. You have to have this reflexive gaze. You have to see yourself seeing. Radical self-understanding is understanding that it's understanding while it's always re-examining its roots. So you're constantly, in Husserlian terms, which is very criticized by the postmodernists, purifying your consciousness, meaning that you're fessing up to your biases. You're realizing that this coffee is round because you're using the term round, right? So you're trying to constantly check up on yourself to make sure that you're not leading yourself down a rosy trail. And then he says this is a peculiar judging procedure in the 125. He's right middle of the page on 125. This brings about a peculiar judging procedure on the scientist's part, in italics. A zigzag judging. Okay? That is, that is, you're going to the object, and then you're going to the mind, and then you're going back to the object, and then you're going to the mind. First making straight for the givenness of something itself, but then going back critically to the provisional results already obtained, whereupon his criticism must also be subjected to criticism. So it's almost an endless criticism of the critique of the acceptance. And, you know, that is an endless regress. And Heidegger, at the end of his life, wrote some very cogent articles on that. But you have to do that. We can't do any better. That's the cards that have been given to us. Note also on this page Husserl's profound realization of the limits of science. He says at the end of that same paragraph, in parentheses, when he talks about getting to true being, he says, an idea, incidentally, the sense and limits of which are not matters for positive science itself to explore. That is, the whole process of this criticism and radical self-understanding, positive science hasn't really appreciated, and maybe it's not even in its bag of responsibilities, although it should be. The crisis is that they don't. So he defines science as cognizing that accepts no judgments as scientific except those that have shown their correctness. And that's, I think, a very important thing. Where does truth originate? Does it originate in method, or does it originate in what Husserl called Evidenz in German, which means immediate insight, in this correctness that he puts in quotes, because it's hard to put a word to it. But I know something is true because I have that experience. I taste that roundness, and that roundness is so true that's where I start. And if anybody says something else, I'll deny it. You know, I mean, like, my experience in my life is there's no such thing as reincarnation. And so I'm living with all these people who presume I believe in it, and I get into a lot of trouble and even satirized by my teachers for being cynical about it. But I'm not about to believe anything that I don't know is certain, right? So that's the kind of faith that Husserl is calling science. And it's an important way to work. Okay, so we'll take a break, and we'll come back and do the crisis of the European sciences. Okay, we're going to pick up with what I believe is the most beautiful passage of phenomenological prose ever written. So beautiful.
I felt that too. Which passage was it?
Or which one?
I would even call it poetry. It's on page 56, under K. The section is Fundamental Significance of the Problem of the Origin of Mathematical Natural Science. Okay, it starts on line 5, the second sentence.
That in itself is an interesting thing.
What?
It starts on line 5, the second sentence. That in itself is very interesting.
Well, that's important. It's so beautiful. I want you to come in right when it can grab you. It's like when you're studying a tape. One of the great things about the digitizing of the tapes is you can pounce right on the exact start of the data that you're looking for. If you have, in the old days when you had to rewind, oh, I remember there was something great that he just said that relates to this. After you spent 10 minutes looking for it and then losing your place, whether you're before it or after it, the enthusiasm of your mind is gone, and so you can't attend to it. So it's so good, I want your enthusiasm to be eager and ready. Okay, fifth line. The developed method. The developed method, the progressive fulfillment of the task, is, as method, an art, which is handed down. But its true meaning is not necessarily handed down with it. And it is precisely for this reason that a theoretical task and achievement like that of a natural science, or any science of the world, which can master the infinity of its subject matter only through infinities of method, and can master the latter infinities only by means of a technical thought and activity which are empty of meaning, can only be and remain meaningful in a true and original sense if the scientist has developed in himself the ability to inquire back into the original meaning of all his meaning structures and methods. That is, into the historical meaning of their primal establishment, and especially into the meaning of all their inherited meanings, taken over unnoticed in this primal establishment, as well as those taken over later on. Okay, that's just wonderful. It's talking about the way that science proceeds by necessarily by relying on method, but how the method eventually becomes empty of meaning. I mean, Gadamer was talking about that in Truth and Method. You need the method, but the method is not where truth lies, right? It's not where the real objectivity is. And you can't convince people in the coffee world who've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in these methods. You can't convince them that that's not where certainty and truth are. And they're suspicious of something subjective. But, okay, using coffee tasting as an example, if it involves your tongue, it's got to be subjective. And so to pretend that it's not is to not be objective. If there's a subjective component in reaching the objectivity of the taste, then you have to admit that subjective component. They get that at BK Coffee. That's why I was so enthused 2 days ago. They understand that, and they're not denying that. And they still develop their technique. They still develop their method, because you have to have a method, and the method becomes a technique. And you master the infinity of its subject matter, all the flavors of coffee, only through the infinities of method. And you become technically expertise at doing that. But it can only remain meaningful if you inquire back into how you developed those methods in the first place. What were you finding? What were you witnessing? I mean, he's describing the fate of all objectivities here. And the fate of all objectivities is to become thinner and thinner in meaning. To have less and less of that original awareness. Certainly not the horizon of meaning in which the method was developed. You know, coffee tasters realized they needed to keep track. And it was good to keep track in this way. And then you come up with different ways. Some forms do it from 1 to 10. Some forms do it from, they have a form, the Cup of Excellence, where I'm going next week in El Salvador. They do 0, 4, 6, and 8. 0, 4, 6, and 8. It's not equal. And that changes the results. The specialty coffees of Italy, they do 1 to 7. So you get a lot of 4s and 5s. Okay? Hard to get a lot of 4s and 5s on a form that's 0, 4, 6, and 8. Right? But anyway, you develop your method for whatever good reason that you have, but you forget what the good reason is. And then you just do it by rote. And when you do it by rote, you're not going to do it as well. That's Husserl's notion. He's saying that the mathematical natural scientists have to go back into the historical meanings and capture what did you inherit. You know, when you read the textbook in mathematics in grammar school and high school and college, what were the inherited meanings? And then what were, and a lot of those meanings you didn't even notice. You kind of like, they were like subliminal, and you maybe discovered them later even. And then there's things that you take over later on, accretions, as mathematical science develops, as your career develops, as you do your research here, there, and this other areas, you pick up things. There's a development. And so part of the concern of phenomenology is to not just take things as static, but to go back and find the originary sense. Originary, that's another word that Microsoft will not allow, right? But it's a technical Husserlian term, and it's a term that's very much under criticism, and we won't go into that here, but the postmodernists say there's no such thing as original. Derrida says everything is derivative. And he's right. But Husserl only means there's a point at which you first put the idea together given an actual experience. That actual experience exists. You can go back that far. You know, they're not original in the sense of Adam and Eve. So you want to keep aware then of the synthetic activities of producing these unities of sense, and not just accept the unities of sense as docile cultural objects. So again, there's seeing, and then in categorially informed seeing that captures the process of categorizing and synthesizing. I mean, it seems like it's impossible because there's no pure seeing. Seeing already involves all that. Of course, and I won't talk about this, there's a kind of seeing in the Tibetan system that they say is direct and unmediated. But I think that's mythology, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I plan on investigating it in the next couple of years. But it's part of this debate. I'm not forcing Husserl onto them. He's acknowledging again here on page 56 the limits of positive science when he says the mathematician, the natural scientist, at best, a highly brilliant technician of the method. I mean, that's a respectful put-down, right? A highly brilliant technician of the method. And Husserl was a mathematician. I mean, he had no reason to dislike mathematicians. But he wanted to basically to ground truth in certainties as a mathematician. And he wasn't able to do it. And it fascinated him. So he began to become a philosopher, to explore why that wasn't possible. On 57, in the middle of that paragraph that's over there, he says, every attempt to lead the scientist to such reflections, if it comes from a mathematical, non-scientific circle of scholars, is rejected as metaphysical. Okay, this is what we would call in Australia a whinge. He's whinging, he's complaining. That oh, this criticism is we're not doing metaphysics, that they put down people doing that. And it's going on this very minute. As I speak, there's a movement at the University of Freiburg to remove the chair that Husserl and Heidegger occupied, that Günter Figal presently occupies. They want to remove it and replace it with an analytic philosopher. And so the whole world is screaming. And I don't know what the politics are on that campus, but it shows you that, I mean, Husserl was there at Freiburg when he was writing this sentence, and things have only gotten worse, right? So it's not like there's a happy ending yet.
Well, it's changing in academic style and power play. It's pure mega trend of analytic philosophers eradicating everybody else.
Yeah,
They did that in Holland completely. There's nobody doing anything non-analytical in language, for example.
Well, there's
And in
the
Germany,
Hobby's
there's some
department.
Hmm?
There's the Center for the Study of Subjectivity at the University of Copenhagen.
Yeah, I talk about Holland.
Oh, Holland, right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But I mean, then in certain areas, I mean, you can see that they just burn the
Oh.
landscape.
Oh,
And they do it
yeah.
in Germany at the moment.
well,
So, and they will do it here, maybe not.
and so his argument is that if positive scientists in no way inquire into the unexamined, taken for granted received method, then there won't be this difference between science and naive everyday practitioners. I mean, what distinguishes science is this capacity to turn the gaze back on itself. This is what science is. But it takes longer to do. It stalls you. You can't move forward as quickly. Okay, let's look at. I forget. Okay. On the next page. What is that?
Which is 105 pages later.
Let's look at 163.
Oh, next page.
He was a mathematician, yeah? 1, 2, 17. Sorry, joke.
Here he says, let's see. Well, I want to read a couple sections here. I just have to find them. Okay, let's start with the middle paragraph on 163. But instead of inquiring further in the sphere of our own intuitions, let us turn our attention to the fact that in our continuously flowing world perceiving, now that continuously is very big news, right? And he uses that continuously also at the line 3 of 164. That continuously is the ongoing character of events. It's the no time out. It's the floating crab game that Garfinkel's talking about. That is, you don't want to reduce affairs to some kind of static sociality, which is what most positive sociologists do. So, in our continuously flowing world perceiving, we are not isolated, but rather have within it contact with other human beings. Right? It's a very frank attention to social phenomena. Each one has his perceptions, his presentifications, his harmonious experiences, devaluation of his certainties into mere possibilities, right? Plenty of those. Doubts, questions, illusions. But in living with one another, each one can take part in the life of the others. Thus, in general, the world exists not only for isolated men, but for the community of men. And this is due to the fact that even what is straightforwardly perceptual is communalized. In this communalization, too, there constantly occurs an alteration of validity through reciprocal correction. In reciprocal understanding, and I think he gets this reciprocal from Simmel, because Simmel talked about reciprocal stimulations as the core interest of sociology, looking at the sociality. In reciprocal understanding, my experiences and experiential acquisitions enter into contact with those of others. So this reciprocal correction, reciprocal understanding is a very general gloss. But what is it a gloss for? We still have to fully explore this. That's what we're doing, I think, in ethnomethodology. There's this kind of, these meanings, these unities of meanings that are produced and stabilized fall apart in this reciprocal. So we have to kind of correct them and the validities get altered a little bit and they get restabilized. And so my hope is I can record enough coffee tasters to see how they're stabilizing those unities of meaning when they come apart, because the coffees are going to throw them apart. I mean, coffees do I mean, it was amazing. 2 days ago, there was one coffee that was totally smooth, I would say like a bass. And then there was, the next coffee was like a tenor, just singing high flavored fruity notes. I mean, there were like 6 coffees on the table, just 4 completely different flavors. You would think they were different plants. So there's always a point at which the categories are going to fall short. You can pin them in the categories, but you want to preserve what is unique about that coffee that you're thinking of paying big bucks for. I mean, one of them was a very expensive coffee that, in fact, he loved it, but he felt he wouldn't be able to afford it because they can't be putting super expensive coffee because they produce so much of it that it's going to be super expensive to buy that much, right? And then once they put it in, they have to commit to paying that for the long run, so they also have to think about what it's going to cost later in years to come, or else their clients will get pissed off being hooked on that flavor. I mean, that's a different seminar. But anyway, but we're talking about reciprocal correction. I mean, they're trying to reestablish the efficacy and vitality of these categorical unities that they're producing. And there's no time out. I mean, the world is always going to fall apart and come back together. And then later in that paragraph, we won't read it all, talking about intersubjective harmony of validity and intersubjective unity. So you get this intersubjectivity, which, okay, this I would say, all of us ethnomethodologists, Garfinkel included, we're thrilled with this notion of intersubjectivity at the end of Husserl's life, although he always talked about intersubjectivity from the very beginning, but he makes a bigger deal of it later, and we're all interested in it. But at the end, we realize it's just a gloss. That intersubjective kind of like says everybody stands alone, and then they come together. But it's not like that. They're together first. And so I'm not happy with using the term intersubjective. But still, the real world experience that intersubjective unity is and intersubjective discrepancies is addressing, those real world phenomena are what we're studying. We just have to find more appropriate ways of describing it. Okay, so you get this social turn in the crisis of the European sciences, which came at the end of his life, and he couldn't avoid the social because by that time he'd been kicked out of his job at Freiburg because the Nazis took over and he was Jewish, and you couldn't deny the social importance of social affairs. And the Origin of Geometry was delivered, I think, in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, I think it was maybe a year before he died, 2 years before he died, when he was practically, he couldn't lecture in Germany. Derrida wrote his doctoral dissertation on the origin of geometry. And he's written a lot about it. It's kind of interesting, very clear Derrida. You don't get a lot of it. Derrida's, I like him very much. But his earlier material, his book on the origin of geometry is one of his clearest. It's not a really long article, and Garfinkel has a paper on this in Human Studies, I don't know, 2005 maybe, I'm not sure, or yeah, maybe it could be earlier. And he recognized well that all scientific constructions are products of the cultural world. And he asks mostly how these scientific products get to be objective? So he asks in a very radical way. And you see that in the bottom of 357 in the footnote. Okay? He says, or more precisely in the line 3, 4, they have their objectivity, their existence for everyone. So is that what objectivity is? How they exist for everybody in a kind of similar way? He says above the page, about a third of the way down, the sensible utterances, on 357 still, have spatio-temporal individuation in the world like all corporeal occurrences. That, he's talking about indexicality there, indexical expressions, have a corporeal nature to them. The term, the utterances, the words are like bodies because they have a sound. They're tangible, but tangible has to do with touch. I don't know if there's a similar word for sound, but they're there in the world, and they can become a focal point for a lot of times when we do our studies. This came out particularly when I was looking at intercultural conversations. There were many situations in which persons like Chinese visiting the U.S., they knew that something was very important in the conversation, a passage that kept getting repeated with a certain energy, but they didn't know what it meant. But they knew that that was the core of what they were supposed to understand. So you know something without knowing what it is. So there's that corporeal nature, and that provides then the focal point for the Chinese and American participants in a conversation. So this observation, I think, illustrates this process of objectivation, that this tangibility is produced by the objectivation. We need that in order so people can get on the same page, even though they're not sure what's on the page. Still, the material facticity of a gloss or of an account or an utterance allows it to serve as the vehicle for what Gurvitch calls in a fabulous phrase, but in the end it's only a gloss that doesn't yet mean enough, intersubjective concatenation of meaning. That is, the way in which people do this reciprocal correction, this reciprocal interconcatenation, which are all just names, but you need an object. You need a place for people to come together. You need the corporeal character of the occurrence, is what Husserl's saying there. I mean, he gets really specific, I think, a little further down. Maybe it's in the main text, not the footnote. It's 3, 6, 9 lines from the bottom of the main larger text on page 357. He says, wherever something is asserted, one can distinguish what is thematic, that about which it is said. Okay? That about which it is said. And sometimes that's all we have. And I like to think of it as an empty palette that remains to be loaded, and people will then start loading it. Like what is full-bodied? What is medium-bodied? And people have the term, they have this thematic object, it's a gloss for what? Garfinkel says it's a gloss for whatever comes to me. He said in his studies of games with rules, he says that rules consist of their consequences. Right? I mean, that's not how people say the rules. The rules are the rules. They have to know what they are ahead of time. No, it's not like that. I mean, it can be on rare occasions, but it's not the norm. So as social phenomenologists, we want to track the local history of that production. And, you know, the temporality that Husserl wrote a lot about is, in fact, the temporality that we're trying to capture in our studies of naturally occurring interaction. So he poses a fabulous question at the bottom of 357. How does geometrical ideality, just like that of all sciences, proceed from its primary intrapersonal, that is one person alone, origin, where it is a structure within the conscious space of the first inventor's soul, to its ideal objectivity? Ideal referring to the self-identical meaning unity that is shared by everybody in the group. So that's the way Husserl poses the question. And, you know, for me, the first inventor's soul is a step too far. I mean, I don't know about souls and I don't know about lone inventors. I want to reverse that. And my argument, which I don't think, I haven't gotten Zahavi to listen to the argument yet. Because every time I make it, he says, yeah, Husserl knows that. But he doesn't know that if he's saying that, if he's always asking how do we get from the individual inventor's soul to the intersubjective, I want to know how do we get from the intersubjective to the individual. I'm reversing that. And I think we need to do a lot of that. I mean, it can be the story, the way Husserl phrases it. It's possible to proceed from one creative idea to its objectivation, and so move from the subjective to the intersubjective. But I don't think that's usually how it happens. I think it's only an ideal version, and not the real version. Because what we have is always already there. And how did it get there? How does this receive stuff that we passively... The whole passive synthesis of Husserl, I think, I don't know enough. I have to spend a good year reading through those texts. That passive synthesis is full of insight, and then in the end maybe is a cop-out. I don't know. But I want to look at more, I mean, with the way we do work now, with our attention to local detail, with the assistance of digital recordings, I mean, I think we can really discover these things from the real world, as Husserl and Garfinkel are both recommending. And you could say, oh yeah, it's both. You know, it can happen one way, it can happen the other way. Or you could say, a lot of people say, oh yeah, there's some kind of dialectics at work, which is too vague to be really helpful. And usually, when philosophers say it, they're secretly keeping the subjective as primary. This Cartesian subject somehow won't die. If there's going to be any original, and there's not, it would be what Husserl is here calling the intersubjective. He says on 358, about 2/3 of the way down, a reciprocal getting along with others. Okay, I mean I mean, you could say ethnomethodology is a study of the reciprocal getting along with others. I mean, that would be adequate. But maybe it doesn't approach the radical character of what we've come upon. On the next page, line 359, he says, in this sense, civilization is, for every man whose we horizon it is, a community of those who can reciprocally express themselves. So this reciprocal, which I'm maintaining he gets from Simmel, because it's in Simmel, and he was reading Simmel's books. And there's all these books by Simmel, well dog-eared in the Husserlian library in Leuven. That this reciprocal expressing is I think important. I mean, that's a reference, I think, although not blatant, to what Husserl would call originary character of intersubjective life. And also on the next page, 360, he comes up with this term co-accomplishment in the middle of the page. A co-accomplishment. What kind? There's no individual there. The co is of course, a small syllable, very vague, and in any case, there's not really accomplishing going, because that retains the Cartesian sense that we're in control of everything, the Lockean sense that we're in charge. We have to depart the Enlightenment and discover, and that's what sociology really is realizing the sense in which the structure, like of the turn-taking, is running the show a lot of the time. It's not that that I'm being dishonest when there's a misunderstanding and I don't explain the misunderstanding. It's that I just didn't get a chance to talk because the conversation didn't provide me with a turn. And then the person said, well, why didn't you correct me? They feel wounded, right? But it's these things kind of run themselves. We're not in charge of everything in the rational decision science way that comes out of the Enlightenment model. So anyway, this co-accomplishment, though, needs the kind of specification, re-specification that we're able to give to it. And we give to it following the principal methodological rule of Husserl, which is not theories, but the things themselves. So he's moving in the direction that we want, but I'm not sure that his attempts to explain it is always helpful. He says, just a little bit below on 360, the productions, below what? Below the co-accomplishment. The productions can reproduce their likenesses from person to person. Well, I don't know if that's how it happens, reproduce it as though they exist before. And in the chain of the understanding of these repetitions, what is self-evident turns up as the same in the consciousness of the other. That's a first attempt, okay, but it's hardly the situation. In the unity of the community of communication among several persons, the repeatedly produced structure becomes an object of consciousness, not as a likeness, but as the one structure common to all. Well, all by that, it does become that. The question is, how does it become the one structure common to all? This is social work. This is sociality, which is the term that Simmel used. This is what people are doing all the time, is somehow get the one structure in common. That's why when I go to London, I get scolded when I'm waiting in the bus line. I mean, I'm not butting in, but I'm just not participating in making this one structure common to all, right? So this is work that people do, and they do it in different ways in different places. And that structure common to all is also Durkheimian. Husserl asks, how does the geometer, he says, the primally establishing geometer, I'm not sure that's adequate, how does the geometer express, transform his internal structure in its ideality into something objective? That's really what we're interested in. Or he says on 159, how does the, oh yeah, I read that one. Then he says, back on 356 toward the bottom, and I wrote that out because I was at home and my scanner was dying and I was desperate. he says, the original, where is that? The original being itself there, in original self-evidence, I'm not sure. Oh no, sorry, it's on 359. Sorry, I have a mistake in my notes. Toward the bottom. The original being itself there, in the immediacy of its first production, that is, in original self-evidence, that's a very big term, that's where truth is, things we really know for sure that we experience, results in no persisting acquisition at all that could have objective existence. That is, the original moment when I have an insight, when I'm tasting that coffee and I capture that flavor and I have no idea how to describe it. It's like, let's say, a basket of fruit, you know. How do I make this a persisting acquisition that can lead to a lot of people communicating about it? This is such an important question. That's our goal, is to make our insights persisting acquisitions. That's why we need to objectivate them. That's why we develop accounts and formulations. That persisting acquisition is everybody's daily work. What Husserl describes does happen pretty much along the ways that he describes it. But these objectivities are maybe already there. They land in our lap passively, as much as they're active productions that we could go back and do an archaeology of, an excavation of, and find out, like what we were reading among the geometers and mathematicians, that you could excavate and get where did it start, where did it go next, where did it go next. We're already having these persisting acquisitions, and that they persist recommends that we keep them, that we retain them. We might not even know what round means to describe coffee, but everybody's using the term, so it's not going away, so I might as well understand what it means. So we need these acquisitions because they're part of the palette. They're not an empty palette, they're a palette filled. They're filled with this term round and with different kind of senses. So now how do we coordinate and reciprocally bring these understandings into some kind of unity? And if you look on 361, you might then be able to understand this wonderful passage on this paragraph just below the middle on 361. We might even end with this. There is a distinction then between passively understanding the expression and making it self-evident by reactivating its meaning. But there also exists possibilities of a kind of activity, a thinking in terms of things that have been taken up merely receptively, passively, which deals with significations only passively understood and taken over, without any of the self-evidence of original activity. That's what I find amazing, and why I included that in your reading is that's the point I'm trying to make. I mean, Husserl often sees the flaw in his thinking. He sees the most original solutions to the problems, and he even begins to describe them as he does here. But then when he goes back to recapping the general theory, he seems to like forget about them because it's too hard and too indeterminate to describe that. But my critique that I just gave you 3 minutes ago is in this passage. You know, maybe without any of the self-evidence of original activity. So I'm amazed that that Husserl is just incredibly deep. And so all I wanted to do today was to convey to you and to people in ethnomethodology that Husserl's deep, okay? And this, I'll leave it to you to reactivate and respecify what that deepness is. If you can use it. If you can't use it, you know, I'm not going to insist on it. But I would say, by way of concluding, that one of my earliest professors, Peter Berger, would be very proud of me right now. Okay.